Hey, everybody, welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, Culture. I'm one of your hosts, Walter.
I'm your co-host, Rob, and today we have Matthew Soerens. He is the VP in Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, whose mission it is to empower the local church to serve the most vulnerable. He is also the author of several books, the most recent of which is Inalienable: How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church, which came out last year. Matt, welcome to Church Coffee.
Yeah, great to be with you guys.
We're going to kick it off nice and slow. How do you take your coffee?
I usually drink my coffee with milk or cream. I'm not really like a coffee snob.
Right on. Easy answer.
Is there a drink snob that you are?
That's a good question. Not really.
No.
I'm like, we were talking before we started recording, I'm from Wisconsin. So like, I'm like a frozen custard snob. Like that's where like, I know.
Okay. Okay. All right, here we go. Do you like Culver's?
I do like Culver's.
Okay.
It's sort of national expansion of a Wisconsin tradition, but there's better if you actually go to Wisconsin.
Okay. I like Culver's. I guess I should do a little bit more frozen custard exploration when I'm up in Madison, Milwaukee, Oconomowoc area this summer. So if you have any recommendations in that area.
I don't drive through Milwaukee without stopping at Kopp's, so that would be my recommendation.
Kopp's, C-O-P-S?
K-O-P-P-S.
K-O-P-P-S, got it. K-O-P-P-S. I will make that happen. Okay,
We plan my visits to my family over what the flavor of the day is. So, I mean,
you know what? I can relate. I went to school over in the Shenandoah Valley at James Madison University, and they have a small custard place called Klein's. It was established in 1945. It's what ice cream should be. It's not like, it's super cream. It's frozen cream. And it's only a 45-minute drive, but the only times I really go back there is when the flavor is appropriate.
I dig it. Okay. All right, Matt. So what's your story and how did you end up at World Relief?
Yeah, so my first exposure to World Relief was as a college student. I went to Wheaton College in Illinois and signed up for this 6-month internship program that sent me to learn about human needs and global resources in the global South. So I was basically assigned to Nicaragua, where I spent 6 months, and my host organization was actually a local partner of World Relief, Nicaragua. So I spent 6 months with World Relief in Nicaragua, and really loved both the mission of empowering churches to serve the most vulnerable, and also just my time there was really meaningful and impactful for me. So I came back to the western suburbs of Chicago, and World Relief actually had an office there as well. And so I applied for a job. I was, finishing up my time in undergrad. Actually, I think I had to apply for a few jobs before I got one, but I started legal services team. And honestly, I didn't really know what World Relief did in the United States. I was, I'd been acquainted with what we did in Nicaragua. But it is the same mission of empowering churches to serve the vulnerable. In the U.S. context, we're primarily focused on refugees and immigration issues. So that was really my primary introduction to immigration issues. I mean, you can't live in Latin America without encountering stories of migration. And in Nicaragua, actually, it's a lot of people who tend to go south to Costa Rica. Some people have obviously gone into the United States as well.
Fascinating. But, what real quick, what did you study in undergrad?
I studied international relations and geology, which I've not really become, but what I do is a little closer to international relations.
Right. Okay. Cool.
That's actually really interesting. Why do most in Nicaragua? Sorry, I don't have the accent, but why do most in Nicaragua, at least at your time there, go to Costa Rica? It just seems framed in the United States mainstream media, or any media really, that like any kind of refugees from Central or South America are just kind of flooding north, and we'll get probably more into that later in the podcast. But that just struck me as like an oddity.
Yeah, I mean, so migration is a global phenomenon, and people tend to go from places with a lot of problems, whether those are economic or political or security, to places with more opportunity, more safety. And Costa Rica is it is not as well off as the United States, but if you look at like gross domestic capita per cap, or gross domestic product per capita, it's way higher in Costa Rica than in most other parts of Central America. It's got a long tradition of peace and relative safety. So and you see people leaving Nicaragua to go to Costa Rica for different reasons at different points in their neighboring countries, right? So like people go to where it's close. And interestingly, you've got a lot of Venezuelans, and we've heard a lot about Venezuelans coming all the way to the United States as well. But most Venezuelans are in Colombia or in Chile, in Peru, Ecuador, and then some of them made their way up to Costa Rica as well. Like Costa Rica is actually Costa Rica is one of the top countries for asylum requests in the last year. I mean,
Wow.
it's
Man.
a fairly small country, and it's largely driven by Nicaraguans and by Venezuelans.
Is there, you've said it's got a long history of good GDP and economic and I guess social stability. Are there several, there's no one factor for that, obviously, but are there, what would be probably this, give us a smattering of factors?
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, actually. I think most of my Tico, Costa Ricans, they call themselves Ticos. My Tico friends would point to the fact that they actually don't have a military. They do have like a national police force, but
But they don't have a military.
They don't have a military. They've really invested their governmental resources in sort of social investment, so education. There's a lot that happens at the governmental level, and I think a lot of Costa Ricans. And you can argue this. You could also argue that they can do that because they have a strong ally in the United States who, would probably defend them if they were invaded by a neighboring country. But it is a fairly symbiotic relationship with the U.S. as well. There's a ton of tourism. That's a big part of their economy.
Okay.
And part of the reason there's a lot of tourism, I mean, part of it is it's beautiful and it's tropical and it's a wonderful place to visit, and I recommend it. But it also is so safe that most Americans go there. And, whereas I would encourage people to visit Nicaragua as well. It's got the same beaches, basically. It's a beautiful place to visit, but doesn't have quite the same reputation politically as Costa Rica does.
Okay.
And, that feeds into their tourism economy as well. And it's not all tourism. There's, they have a lot of agriculture in Costa Rica. They've got a lot going on. They actually have a lot of like call centers where.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. So one of my buddies / clients, he has he works with a call center in Costa Rica that calls US properties to see if they want to sell their houses. So random fact that I learned the other day.
Yep. I mean, I've had friends in Costa Rica. I spent some time in Costa Rica as well. So I know of a lot of people there also. And actually a lot of what I did in Costa Rica was before my time with World Relief was with Nicaraguan migrants in Costa Rica, again, because they tend to be, for me, it was actually where I feel like God really, this goes to the question of my story and how I ended up at World Relief. I spent a summer in Costa Rica, my freshman year in college, where I was basically volunteering with this Christian ministry that cares for, in a particular neighborhood in San Jose, La Carpio, that is mostly a Nicaraguan immigrant community. And very quickly, I noticed that, like, people in this community worked incredibly hard. They do some of the hardest work of anyone in the country, and they're just kind of barely making by. It's basically like in Spanish, they call it like a paracaidista, like it's a parachuter. Like people just like built up little formal housing, and some of that's been formalized over the years. But I also would hear a lot of kind of ugly rhetoric about Nicaraguans from some of my Costa Rican friends. Not all by any means, but like it's sort of common in Costa Rica to hear things like, "Oh, Nicaraguans, they're responsible for all the crime in the country," or they're stealing our jobs, or they're lazy, which I never knew how to put those two things together. But like it really bothered me because I was getting to know Nicaraguan families, and they're really kind people, not perfect people, but like, people in really hard circumstances working incredibly hard. And then I really feel like God convicted me at a certain point that actually that's the sort of rhetoric I've heard about Mexicans in the United States. And maybe never had really critically thought about very much, but it's just sort of, part of the media ecosystem, especially as a kid growing up in a fairly ethnically homogenous community in Wisconsin. Like that, I just hadn't heard anything other than what I heard on television. And it really challenged me, like, oh, I've heard those sort of things. And, maybe they're not true. Maybe like I should go and investigate who my neighbors are who are immigrants in the US context. And that's part of what led me to the work that I ultimately did, or what I did and still do at World Relief. I moved into a neighborhood about the time that I started working at World Relief, where most of my neighbors were immigrants from one background or another. A lot of refugees were settled from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, but also a lot of immigrants, primarily from Mexico. some of whom had legal status, some of whom it turns out didn't. And that was sort of another like, oh, what do I do with that as a Christian? What do I
Right.
do with that? I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but also I'm supposed to follow the law. How do you put all those pieces together? So,
Right.
and that all came together with my role at World Relief, where I was actually understanding what the law actually said in terms of U.S. immigration law. Because one of my first jobs at World Relief was as a legal counselor, helping people understand their options under U.S. immigration law and pursuing them when they qualify.
Yeah. Fascinating.
We're going to take a quick break and have a word from a sponsor. Shenandoah Coffee Roasters has been a staple of Charlottesville since 1993. They offer over 25 varieties of specialty, boutique, and gourmet coffee using only the finest Arabia coffee from all over the world. Coffee is their passion, and they painstakingly search out the best coffee available. Nothing is taken for granted as they continually strive to provide the best coffee they possibly can. They roast all their coffees to order based on the needs of their espresso bar, ensuring that only the freshest and highest quality coffee leaves their roasting house. Grab a cup at any of their 3 locations, Main Restaurant Preston, on the corner, or on Ivy Road. Or order a bag online at shenandoahjoe.com.
Man. So I assume just with how you're able to pronounce stuff that you can speak Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, not perfectly, but I spent enough time in Latin America, and even where I live in Aurora, Illinois, it's a mostly Mexican neighborhood where I live, and my wife and I go to church in Spanish.
Oh, nice. Very good. Very good. Yeah. I mean, I work predominantly around all Latinos, mainly Mexicans, but it's ironic because some of my Mexican subs will be like, hey, we don't want to be around here when the El Salvadorian subs are here. I'm like, come on, guys, we're all just trying to work. Like, let's have each other's back. So, all right, can you give us a quick history of World Relief?
Yeah, so World Relief, fascinatingly, I spent the morning over at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center archives learning about the history of World Relief, but I won't tell you everything I just learned. We're preparing to celebrate our 80th anniversary, and I was sort of tasked with digging up some archival information. We were
happy birthday.
In 1944 as the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, actually out of a church in Boston, Park Street Church, that wanted to help care for people who'd been displaced by the war in Europe in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Matt, a quick, sorry to interrupt, but Park Street Baptist, Walter Kim, was my former pastor.
Yeah. So, Walter is, and now he's the president of the NAE, which is still our parent organization. So we have, and Park Street is still an important partner for World Relief still 80 years later. Like they've been an incredibly important partner, part of our story. But yeah, that was our origins. It was how do we help churches in another place, in this case in Europe, respond to the devastation caused by the war. We were originally actually the War Relief Commission, and then World Relief Commission, and then over time it just was shortened to World Relief. We've had that mission of empowering churches to care for the vulnerable, and whether that was formally this mission statement or not, that's effectively been on what we've done since our founding. And that's included in the U.S. context since the mid-70s, mid to late 70s, we've been involved in refugee resettlement. So working with the U.S. State Department, but then also with lots and lots of churches to receive refugees that have been admitted by the U.S. government to rebuild their lives in the United States.
How does, kind of building off of that answer, how does World Relief ground its NGO-ish work in biblical theology? I guess asked another way, what is World Relief's current operations and goals, and how does it draw on the Bible for those as inspiration?
Yeah, as an organization that was birthed out of a church and still as our mission focused on the church, we are, our ultimate guide is Scripture. One thing that's really important to us at World Relief, and this is sort of a theological concept we borrow, originally from Latin America, is the idea of integral mission. That when we talk about what is our mission? It's because we're called to love our neighbors as ourselves. It's caring about the whole of people. That's their physical needs, their spiritual needs, and their emotional needs. We don't want to separate. And we're not just concerned about saving souls, and neither are we just concerned about filling people's bellies. We care about the whole of people, and that's rooted in this idea. And frankly, that also extends to we care about individuals, but we also care about societies and systems and structures, because ultimately those systems and structures affect individual people. And that's part of the reason that I have a job at World Relief focused on advocacy and policy, because the vast majority of the work that we do around the world and in the US is sort of the individual intervention. How do we help this, this woman who's been widowed and is living in poverty, survive and hopefully thrive? How do we help this refugee adjust to life in a new country, get their kids into school, help them find a job, help them find housing, all those things. But ultimately, all of those dynamics at the ground level are affected by government policies, by systems and structures. And so my job is to help us think from a Christian perspective and help us mobilize churches to help address those policy dynamics as well.
Great. How does World Relief balance the submission to authorities, Paulian aspect we see in Romans 13, or even the Preterin in 1 Peter 2, with the biblical call for harboring the sojourner? I almost it seems like throughout American history, there's been this kind of refrain of like the Irish are bad and then the Italians are bad. And we're kind of in the framework right now where the Hispanics, whether they be Central Americans or South Americans or Venezuelans or Nicaraguans or Mexicans, like how do we balance that? Yes, we need to take these people in but we have laws, like they're not supposed to come in illegally, but here's these people sometimes literally on our doorstep who's family of 5 and they need food and water. Like how do we balance that? We had a professor at Wheaton actually on the podcast a few weeks ago, just talking about biblical theology and immigration, and just the such low numbers for such a big country that we allow in right now. So how do you kind of help balance those two aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the tension points, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have we could go through like literally dozens of passages in both the Old and the New Testament on the theme of hospitality, which in the Greek of the New Testament is literally the love of strangers. You have not only the general command to love your neighbors yourself, you also have specific instructions, especially in the Hebrew scriptures, to love the foreigner. So you have all of that. And then you also have, you brought up Romans 13. That's probably the passage that I get asked about most often. It's be subject to the governing authorities. So can we do both? And I think the good news is the answer is almost always yes. Like there's not the inherent contradiction that I think that sometimes people and sometimes even like churches as institutions are concerned that there is. To start with, I mean, we've talked about immigrants generally. It's worth noting that 3/4 of immigrants in the United States are lawfully present, right? So the refugee resettlement program is a lawful process. It was established by Congress back in 1980 with the Refugee Act. The refugees that World Relief meets at the airport and helps to rebuild their lives in the United States, those people were invited to come by the U.S. government, and they have been vetted overseas by the U.S. government. It's a very small share of the world's refugees who make the cut in any given year. It's been particularly low in the last several years, but even in like a robust year, we're talking about 1/2 of 1%. Recent years, we've sometimes been a 1/10 of 1% or less of the world's refugees. So, but all of that is a legal process. So there's really nothing, Romans 13 has almost nothing to say to that, except for, I guess, the government is inviting American citizens to be a part of welcoming refugees. Where it's more complicated is those immigrants who are not lawfully present, meaning either that they overstayed a temporary visa, which is about half of the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, or that they crossed the border unlawfully and successfully and made it across the border and without getting caught. So the good news, again, from my perspective there is, what should we do as Christians with those people? Actually, as an American citizen, if I happen to know that my neighbor crossed the border unlawfully 15 years ago, there's nothing in our laws at the federal level or in the state of Illinois where I live, or, really in any of the state that I'm aware of, that would say that I can't have them over for a meal and have dinner with them, that I can't be kind to them. There's nothing in our laws that says that as a church, we can't offer an English class or a food pantry or share the gospel with them or teach them Sunday school or let them teach Sunday school to you. So long as there's not compensation involved. That is actually what the law has something to say to, is employment. And that's a complicated issue. I know churches that have struggled with this, because what do you do when someone seems to have a call to pastoral ministry, but they are not authorized to work? That does occasionally come up, but that's not the most typical situation. I mean, in terms of how should a church minister to their immigrant neighbors, I'd say the answer is robustly, and you're still complying with the laws that God has placed from the government that God has placed over us. Now, the church has one role, and I think that's actually the easy part. The harder part is, what is government? How does government address our policies in ways that both respect the rule of law and ensure security and protection for American citizens, which is part of their divinely ordained function, while also being compassionate and frankly, um, leveraging the benefit that immigration is historically, it has been, and I think can be for the United States as well. I mean, there's been a lot of sort of hand wringing and headline news stories about all the people being apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border in the last year in particular. But interestingly, those numbers are still far less than the number of jobs that there are in the United States economy for which there's no one applying. I mean, we have far more jobs than we have people looking for work right now.
Yeah, right. I can, sorry, man, I'm gonna interrupt real quick. I thought that's fascinating. Is you're like, oh, we're expecting these thousands upon thousands, and you're like, yeah, but we have how many millions of job openings?
Like 5 million jobs more than we have people looking for work.
Now, technically, some of those might be sales, which are, I could argue with somebody about whether or not those are real jobs or not. But you're like, well, we have
even if you cut that in half, even if you cut that by,
we still need 2.5, right? Like we still need a lot of people. If you have people coming who want to work, how do you empower them then to work so that we can meet the needs? Because at the end, how do we not all benefit? Anyways, I'm done, Matt.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, in my view, like one of the big problems we have at this U.S.-Mexico border right now is we have people coming. They're mostly not coming and trying to sneak into the country. They're trying to look for the Border Patrol to seek asylum, which is a legal process. The challenge is some of them don't qualify, real honestly. Some of them actually, they've heard they should seek asylum, but fleeing poverty doesn't qualify for asylum. Fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution does for particular reasons. Some of them meet that definition. They're fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution. And yet, even then, if they are allowed into the United States to pursue their asylum claim, they can't apply for work authorization till they can find an immigration attorney to help them file an asylum request. And then it's 5 months after you submit your asylum request, you can request work authorization. And then it takes time to process that work authorization request. And so the reality is, unless you're like independently wealthy or you have some relative who's supporting you, a lot of those people are working without authorization. That's just kind of how it works. Because you have
absolutely.
Nobody's offering to cover their rent, like that's the challenge.
But and again, I work in construction. I see that all the time.
Yeah.
Like so-and-so plumber, hey, oh, your cousin just came over, right? Or hey, this person just showed up, and you're like, okay, hey, whatever. As long as you're working hard, I don't care. Treat them with respect. We're still going to follow all the laws, so I see it all the time.
I think that's the challenge is there's people who absolutely want to employ those people, even if it's not technically lawful, and treat them with respect. There's also people who will look for the people who are not here lawfully because they don't have to treat them with respect. They don't have to
exactly. Yeah.
They don't have to pay them the minimum wage. Really, everyone benefits, both a vulnerable foreign-born worker, but also the American workers who have to, in some ways, compete with them when there's a fair, level playing field. So having this category of people who are unauthorized to work but are still going to work. I mean, actually, undocumented immigrants, undocumented adult men in particular, have a higher labor participation rate than native-born U.S. citizens. Like, even though they are not authorized to be working, they're more likely to be working than the average American citizen. And some of that is just basic economics. There's nobody else is going to pay their rent or cover their grocery bill if they're not working.
Right.
And for some of them, that's precisely why they came in the first place. Others, well, really, someone was threatening to kill them, and that's why they came in the first place. And the law treats them differently based on the reason that they came. But my view is we ought to have more visas available to at least meet the needs of the U.S. labor market. And those should be available at the consulate in your country of origin without having to get to the border to seek asylum.
That'd be interesting. Yeah.
And we have some of those, just not nearly enough. I mean, it's very...
Just not near, yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so let me ask, in what ways do people need to understand, I guess, the importance of immigration, the importance of even migration? Since Adam and Eve, we've been on the move, right? Mm-hmm. We've been on the move. What do we need? In what ways do we need to understand the importance of that, of immigration policy and even immigration reform?
I think for a lot of Americans, especially those like me, whose maybe ancestors came here 100, 200 years ago, we tend to have a really dated understanding of how our immigration system works. A lot of Americans, especially whose ancestors came from Europe in that, sort of Ellis Island era or before, have this sort of romantic idea. People came and they wanted to make a new life for themselves, so they work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And the reality is that's always, of course, based a little in mythology. Like some of that was true and some of it wasn't true. But we don't have Ellis Island anymore. I mean, now it's a museum and it's a very good museum. I recommend it to people. But you can't just show up in the United States and say, hey, I'd like to make a new life in the United States. That's not our process. It hasn't been that process for more than 100 years at this point. Now you need an immigrant visa, and the eligibility for immigrant visa is very limited based on certain categories. So if you're married to a U.S. citizen, that's a category. Doesn't mean you're guaranteed even then that it's easy, but like there's a visa for that. If you're the parent of a U.S. citizen and your child is over 21 years old, there's a process for that. Although if that child was born in the United States and you've been here unlawfully that whole time, that's probably not going to benefit you, because there's other things that qualify you. There's immigrant visas for people with an employer sponsored, but usually that's only if you've got an advanced level of education or skill or training.
Yep.
There's refugee status if you can prove that you have, you fled a credible fear of persecution on account of your race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. But again, last year we resettled about 30,000 refugees, and there's now 35 million refugees in the world. So like very small share of the world's refugees who are getting selected for a settlement either. You have these very limited categories, and then you have a bunch of people who just don't fit in any of those categories. And then we have to figure out as a country, and frankly, as individuals, as churches, how do we respond to those who do come, either overstaying a temporary visa or successfully entering the country unlawfully. And the other dynamic that I think a lot of Americans don't understand is that it used to be 10 years ago, most of the people coming to the border were trying to sneak in. Like that was the goal, was to sneak across the border. There's still some of that. But what's much more common now is actually people they're looking for the border patrol because they want to seek asylum. And again, there's a mix of people with really strong asylum claims, people with kind of marginal asylum claims, people who don't really qualify for asylum at all, but don't know what asylum is. Someone just told them this is what you should do. But it does change the border security dynamic when people aren't trying to evade law enforcement, they're trying to find law enforcement at the border. And our asylum adjudication systems are woefully both out of date and we're so far from capacity to actually respond to the number of people who are showing up. So even if you are able to enter that asylum process, the average wait time to get a final adjudication on an asylum hearing in immigration court is about 4.5 years.
That is a long time. Well, in that vein, we have a follow-up question. So within that vein, I think both sides of the political aisle, within church, without church, just in general, a lot of people are just like, well, immigration system is broken. So since kind of that seems to be a pretty agreed upon problem, what are some policy solutions that World Relief poses for immigration, specifically to the US? But if you have other immigration solutions from or to elsewhere, those would also be interesting to hear as well.
Yeah, I think big picture, like what we've advocated for a long time now, World Relief has been, it should be harder to immigrate illegally. We're for having secure borders. We don't think people should be able to basically sneak into the country. But also, we should make it easier to immigrate legally. We should have a number of visas that's tied to the needs of the U.S. labor market, tied to the interest that there is in having families be together, and in our both moral and legal commitment to offering protection to those who are fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution. And then the third piece of that sort of three-legged stool, so harder to immigrate illegally, easier to immigrate legally, and then there's got to be some process to fix what's happened up to this point. So you've got roughly 11 million immigrants who are here unlawfully. What we've said is we don't think that, going back to that biblical principle of respecting the rule of law and the governing authorities that God has placed over us, we don't think it is right to just do an amnesty that says you broke the law, it's forgiven and forgotten, here's your citizenship. We also don't think it's either humane or just practical to deport 11 million people. So what we've said is, what would be a process where people could come forward, if they have violated an immigration law, they can admit that, pay a fine. So there's a consequence. That's why it's not amnesty. And of course, if you also committed a serious violent crime, sure, deport those people if they ever get out of jail. But that's actually a very small share of immigrants who are unlawfully in the country. There's good data on this out of Texas in particular, that immigrants actually, whether they're lawfully present or not, commit violent crime at significantly lower rates than native-born U.S. citizens. And again, that's
because they don't want to leave. They wanted to be here, and I've known several people who have been here legally, and they say they drive 2 or 3 miles under the speed limit.
Yeah,
they don't even drive the speed limit. They say we drive just enough under to make sure they're fine.
there's a very strong disincentive to being caught by the police, even for a fairly minor criminal offense that could lead to an immigration legal problem.
Right.
Yeah, I have a friend that got rear-ended by someone who spoke Spanish and got out, and they just said no policia, no policia. And I'm like, okay, well, this wasn't my fault. They rear-ended someone else, so it would have been their fault anyway. It would have been the American's fault, and the person got it, said no policia, no policia. And it's like, all right, well, that's fine by me.
Yeah, that's a fairly common dynamic. All that to say, for those who do commit crimes, sure, there should be penalties. If your only crime was an immigration violation, you overstayed a visa, you crossed the border unlawfully, let's have a fine that people pay and a process by which they could earn permanent legal status and eventually citizenship. That's actually roughly what President Bush proposed in 2006. In fact, a bill that did those three things passed the U.S. Senate back in 2006. President Obama supported something very similar in 2013. The bill passed the U.S. Senate then. It's never passed the House. And actually, there's a bill just in the last couple months. There's a bill introduced with 4 Republican, 4 Democratic co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. So that's the notable thing there is that it's bipartisan, which means it could theoretically pass both chambers of Congress, one of which is controlled by Republicans and one of which is controlled by Democrats. It basically does the same thing. It proposes a $5,000 fine. This bill is called the Dignity Act for undocumented immigrants to be able to earn permanent legal status. It'd have like dreamers who were brought as children, they wouldn't have to pay that fine.
Right.
The rationale would be they were brought here as kids, they shouldn't be penalized in the same way. It would create a bunch of new immigrant visas, including shortening times for family reunification, which right now is a huge problem. And it would invest $35 billion in border security, about $25 billion of that between ports of entry, so barriers and personnel to between lawful ports of entry, and about $10 billion at the ports of entry, which is also an element that I think people don't notice enough. Like, we hear a lot about concerns about fentanyl, which is a very real problem in the United States, and it is true that a lot of fentanyl comes through or from Mexico. What's not true is that it comes with immigrants crossing the border unlawfully, and more than 90% of it with lawful residents or U.S. citizens crossing at lawful entry. And that's where you have to. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard problem to address for sure, but no amount of walls will fix that. You have to address it at better technology and personnel.
It's coming on trucks. It's coming. Yeah, I'm like, it's coming. Yeah, it's coming all over the place. So
that's what we've supported. I mean, we've been encouraged by that bill's introduction, although to be real honest, it's got an uphill climb, as does almost anything in the current U.S. Congress. But we still think that's the sort of policy that really both honors the law and honors the role of the government that we think God has placed, and also
honors human dignity too, and compassion. Yeah,
God. Yeah,
absolutely. Hey, so what are some policies related to work that would help immigrants, legal or not, thrive in the U.S.? Or are there things you guys are supporting or that you think need to be brought up?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are like work authorization is a very central thing, and that's a governmental policy that we can't, we can advocate for, but we can't change unilaterally. One, in terms of like a government policy that I also would mention, the U.S. brought about 70,000 Afghans to this country about 2 years ago now. And they were brought here lawfully with parole status. They're authorized to work, but they were given only temporary status. And now they can renew their temporary status, but if they, can't get the documents completed in the right time, they're going to lose their work authorization and could lose their jobs, which is just dumb. Like they're not going back to Afghanistan. They can't. It's not, unfortunately, a safe place to go back to. And their employers want them here. And I mean, if anything, I think we should be doing more to bring Afghans. So that we haven't fixed that issue is like a huge challenge, and that it would take an act of Congress. There is a bill in Congress, or there was in the last Congress, the Afghan Adjustment Act.
I remember that one.
Bipartisan support, but it didn't actually get called to a vote in the last Congress, and at this point, it hasn't been reintroduced yet. So that would be one. That would be specifically related to work, availability for Afghans in particular.
That blows my mind. We bring these folks here, give them temporary status, but then it's like, well, you got to renew, or you're going to lose the ability to work, and you're going to get deported. I'm like, wait, were we not thinking that all the way through?
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. There's
work authorization.
I mean, that's in terms of governmental policy. I mean, another thing, and this is usually a state level issue, but a lot of immigrants bring a ton of skills and education into the labor market, but they
Yes.
may not be credentialed to use those skills in the United States.
Yeah.
So especially at a time we're facing shortages in particular sectors of the economy, I think one of the things that certain states are doing, and the smarter states are doing, honestly, is looking at how do we fast track people who actually have the education necessary to do this job, but help them to get up to speed in terms of the credentialing process in the United States. So all sorts of careers, you have to be licensed, whether you're a medical doctor or an attorney, but also like a hair cutter, like very basic things. And many states have like a licensing process.
Yeah.
Basic, but like, and we're not just talking about things with a doctoral degree. There's different levels of education and skill that isn't always, you need certain.
Well, it's like in Texas, you have TDLR, Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. Well, you got to go through beauty school to be able to do hair, to get a license to do cosmetology. Where I'm like, you have some African women who have been doing hair since they're 6 years old and can work around Paul Mitchell and all of them, but because they lobby, so it's like these things. You're like, no, like some of these things like, I would probably argue I think are unconstitutional.
I can't believe you have to have a license, but I think maybe you can get paid more. You'll be like more get a certification, but that'll make you worth more. But
I mean, that's something like here in Illinois, where I live several years ago, that was something, and it was actually a lot of the African immigrant community that helped advocate to changing some of the rules, because they're like, we know how to braid hair, like they making us go to an extra level of schooling to be able to do what we've been doing, much of our lives. Making sense.
Recommendations on how people can begin to understand immigration in the U.S. Any recommendations on that?
Well, very self-servingly, I co-wrote a book on that theme, especially for Christians. So, Welcoming the Stranger, with my former colleague Jenny Yang, we did a number of years ago, but we did a new edition just a few years ago. So hopefully that's a good resource. World Relief has a bunch of resources on our website as well, worldrelief.org, especially for Christians, for churches trying to think about this issue from a theological perspective. And then we're also part of something called the Evangelical Immigration Table that we lead along with the National Association of Evangelicals, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, and various others. So we've got a Bible reading guide there at the Evangelical Immigration Table website. It's just evangelicalimmigrationtable.com. There's a ebook that people can look at. There's a bunch of resources.
Whenever I hear all the evangelical, I was part of InterVarsity, so International Fellowship of IVCF. Oh my God, I can't. Anyways, when I start hearing those, just brings me back up to, all those good times.
Lots of acronyms, yes.
Yeah, a lot of acronyms.
Final-ish question, and kind of piggybacking all of that, what are some practical ways people can help the immigrant in our country?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because that's really the heart of the work that we do at World Relief, is coming alongside people, especially as they're first arriving. So we have opportunities for churches, for individuals to volunteer, especially in the communities where World Relief has offices. But even we've just joined a new program with the State Department to do private sponsorship for refugees, which actually will make it possible for refugees to be resettled even in communities where there may not be a World Relief office or another refugee resettlement organization. We're building that out right now. So there's information on that on our website. And then, even without the help of World Relief necessarily, like there's churches in every community that are serving their immigrant neighbors. There's immigrant churches that are serving a mostly immigrant congregation. So it might be just asking, hey, is there any way that I could help? Do you have any things we could, contribute? And certainly financially as well. World Relief, we have our monthly giving program is called The Path. It's a way for people to be about the work that we do all over the world, both in the US, but also internationally. And that includes addressing the root causes of why so many people feel that they need to migrate in the first place. So that's another thing I would love for people to join in. It's just worldrelief.org/the path.
We'll drop that in the show notes. Matt, we wanted to give you one last bit before we sign off. What are other things that about immigration or about World Relief you want people to know, want people to share? You also have two other books. So we mentioned Inalienable at the top, and you mentioned Welcoming the Stranger. That book I have, but you also have one other book. So we'll drop your Amazon at the bottom as well.
Yeah, the other book is called Seeking Refuge. So those three books, I would say, hopefully they're all good resources. What my co-authors and I try to do with Inalienable might be a good place to close, which is just a reminder that, there's lots of good biblical reasons for churches and American Christians to welcome immigrants. But also, I really believe that God is working through migration to accomplish his purposes. And that includes bringing a lot of people who bring a very vibrant Christian faith with them to the United States, who are addressing some of the challenges that we face in American evangelicalism in particular, but American Christianity more broadly as well. That's sort of the central thesis of the book is, some of the parts of the church that have maybe not been in the center of American Christianity historically have a lot of wisdom and experience that the whole of the church in the United States and actually around the world needs. And we need the humility to be able to listen to those believers as well. So hopefully that's one of our goals with the book, is to kind of lift up some of those voices, both in terms of immigrants to the United States as well as believers in other parts of the world.
Great. Matthew, thanks so much for coming on Church Coffee.
Yeah,
we'll
thanks
see you
for
again. A quick note before we go. I had forgotten to say this, but I think a great evangelistic output today in our especially secularizing culture is doing that hard on the ground social work, whether it's feeding the homeless or housing the immigrant or a variety of different ways to show other people, especially secular and liberal and progressive people, that conservative, traditional Christians do care about these social aspects of our world. Those are images of God, and they should be loved and protected as anyone else. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.